What is most revealing about a new pope? Instantly, Sam. What tells you something?
Their name.
Their name. The name they take. And that's their own choice. And the name that the new pope has chosen is Pope Leo XIV. That is incredibly revealing. The smoke is white. What does white smoke mean, man, Sam?
There's a new pope.
There is a new pope. And what is extraordinary, even though we don't know that much about him, but what is extraordinary about him?
He's the first pope ever from the United States.
Ever. Which is absolutely extraordinary. And, you know, I think is very much to be commended for the church because it shows the broad reach of the church. It's no longer, you know, anywhere close to a European institution. In fact, the previous Pope Francis, was from Latin America. And now we have a pope from the United States. I understand he's from Chicago via the Augustinian Order and Villanova University. Now, I know very little about Robert Prevost, the new pope, but the early reviews seem to be very positive.
Right.
He's talked about building bridges. He seems to be a man of true spirituality and humility, which is extremely important. He's worked not only in the United States, but extensively in Latin America. What is most revealing about a new pope? Instantly, Sam. What tells you something?
What's most revealing? Oh, their name.
Their name. The name they take. And that's their own choice. And the name that the new pope has chosen is Pope Leo XIV. That is incredibly revealing because the previous Pope Leo, who reigned in the late 19th and early 20th century, was one of the most influential popes in modern history, and in my view and in the view of many observers, an incredibly positive influence on the church and on the world.
Oh.
What did he author, Sam?
He authored Rerum Novarum.
Or Novarum, I'm not sure.
I don't know how to say it either.
Which it is, but it's an encyclical on the conditions of labor, which talks about labor and capital, way ahead of his time.
Right.
Back in 1891. And it really, to this day, defines the social economic teachings of the Catholic Church. I'm very familiar with the encyclical, even though wasn't sure how to pronounce it. I've written about it a little bit because it was such of thunderous importance in the late 19th century, when, in fact, we had the growth of corporate capitalism, an expansion of industrialism, the explosion of an enormous proletariat working class, and the rise of socialism and communist movements around the world. So Pope Leo XIII was directly addressing himself to the burning issues of our time, and in a very positive way. He critiqued both unbridled capitalism and socialism, although his critique of socialism was maybe a little bit more muted because he had some sympathy for it, but not much for unbridled capitalism. And he talked about the need to care for the poor and the wretched of the earth and to uphold justice and labor rights. One of the leading Catholic organizations did a quick summary of some of the key points. I mean, it's an extensive document. We could spend a month on it, but here are just a few things, and they still very much speak to all of us today in the modern world. Just wages, quote, wages should be sufficient to support a worker and their family, not just bare survival. What does that say about what's going on today with wages, Sam? 130 some odd years later.
They still haven't fixed the problem.
We're still not there.
Yeah.
You know, the minimum wage hasn't been revised, I think, since the Clinton administration. It's nowhere close, not even in the ballpark for a living wage. Workers' associations, quote, unions and trade groups should be encouraged to give workers a collective voice. The most important of all are working men's unions. Such associations should be multiplied and suited to the times. How does that fit what's going on today? What's happening with unions?
Busting
They are being
up.
under attack and really have been ever since a conservative Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. Limited work hours. Excessive work hours damage workers' health and family life. It is neither just nor human to grind men down with excessive labor so as to stupefy their minds and wear out their bodies. What does that say?
Someone needs to tell that to Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And Jeff Bezos and all these billionaires who want people to work till they drop for them.
All right, and here's maybe the most explosive. And this is just a top of the iceberg summary of an incredibly detailed and extraordinary encyclical. The wealthy, along with the church, should actively support the poor. Get this, Sam.
Okay.
Quote, the rich should share their superfluous wealth with the poor as a duty, not of justice, save in extreme cases, but of Christian charity. A duty to share superfluous wealth with the poor.
Someone should tell it to Donald Trump.
How about Elon Musk?
How about Elon Musk?
How about Jeff Bezos?
Bezos.
Bezos.
I don't know. Is it Bezos or Bezos?
I don't know. It doesn't matter. We know who he is.
Right.
I mean, you can tell that to any of these billionaires. Here is what Natalia Imperatori Lee, the chair of religious studies at Manhattan University, had to say. So don't just take my word for it, but an expert in theology. The name Pope Leo XIV really means to me he will continue the work of Leo XIII. Bezos?
Sorry, I found the...
Jeff Bezos.
Bezos. Who cares?
Who cares?
She goes on to say the name is a deep sign of commitment to social issues. I think this new pope is saying something about social justice. By choosing this name, it's going to be a priority. He's continuing a lot of Francis's ministry. And, you know, in his first brief statement, he talked about building bridges.
Right.
That's not something, you know, a far out right-wing church ideologue would be talking about, or, you know, conservative ideologues in the U.S. or anywhere
Right.
would be talking about. Of course, it remains to be seen how he addresses the burning issues of our time that, of course, affect a spiritual leader of 1.4 million persons, 1.4 billion persons around the world. Will he clean up his own house when it comes to the tragedy of sexual abuse within the church? He has been somewhat criticized as maybe not being strong enough for that. Will he, like Pope Francis, address the existential threat of climate change, which threatens our survival and well-being on the planet, and particularly particularly challenges the poor and the less affluent, who Leo XIII was so concerned about? Will he address the enormous, crushing inequality of income and wealth that marks societies today, sadly, all over the world? What will he do about the continuing, ongoing violations of human rights across the world and the continuing violence we see in Gaza, in Yemen, in Ukraine. And now, sadly, we have a brand new conflict, right, Sam? That's very dangerous.
Right. In India and Pakistan.
India and Pakistan, two of the largest nations in the world. So that's another challenge, violence, human rights around the world, that remains to be seen how this Pope will address them. But I have to say, it's only been a few hours.
Right. We still have no idea.
Well, we have some idea.
Well, we have some idea.
Some idea. And, the early reviews, for the most part, it's never 100%. No one's 100% positive. Maybe you are, but, most people are not. So we don't know. Obviously, it's going to take months and years.
Right.
And as Pope goes, he's a pretty young guy.
As popes go, yeah.
As popes go. He's 69. Pope Francis, I think, lived to be 88. So he could have, close to a 20-year pontificate, or maybe even longer or less. Who knows? But, he's not excessively old for a pope. So his legacy will unfold over months and years. And
there is some... We still need to figure out what his stance on gay rights are, the inclusion of women and the gender equality and things like those. I believe it was said that he might have had some controversial, non-progressive stance on gay rights. But again, I guess we just
the whole church pretty much does.
Of course.
That would not single him out.
No, I'm not saying it does, but I'm just saying, how far will he go in his progressivism? Yeah,
that's a very good question. And who knows? That's a very tough question.
What's your theory? Why do you think they picked a pope from the United States? Was it about him being from the United States, or do you think they just thought he was the best man for the job?
I think it was because he was the best. Of course, it's always men within the church.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. So the best man for the job. Yeah. We never heard of him. Probably 99.99% of Americans never heard of him. But he was a favorite of Pope Francis, who was extremely well regarded in the College of Cardinals. And he was appointed by Francis and had a very high position in the church. He was the head of the organization that vetted bishops, those who head the church in various cities around the world. And he had roots not just in the United States, but also, as we talked about, in Latin America.
Right.
And Latin America is one of the great growth areas of the church, much more so than Europe.
I have a theory. This is just speculation, just a hunch, but I think that the cardinals picked him because this group of cardinals, it seems to me, are a pretty progressive group. And I think, they want him to continue the progressive agenda and move the church into the 21st century. But, while Pope Francis was critical of Trump, he was never explicitly critical of Trump.
Wasn't his style.
Right. And I think they might have picked a American pope because an American pope will have more agency to be explicitly go against Trump.
Americans are brash too, right?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And, America's the most powerful country in the world. We've got our hands in all the world conflicts. We've got our hand in immigration and migration. I don't know if you want to call it a crisis, but explosion across the world.
Peace, climate change.
Maybe they picked him because they're like, look, we want an American who's going to hold America's feet to the fire.
Let's hope. And,
that's my theory.
He does seem to be very much in the mold of Francis, who did stand up for human rights, for the dignity of every human being, was mildly, at least indirectly, critical of Trump and of J.D. Vance. He was pretty sharply critical of this idiocy from J.D. Vance, where he said, we don't need to worry too much about, lives in Ukraine because, the value of lives for us diminishes the farther you get from the United States. And Francis was pretty clear in rebuking him, saying all lives are equally precious. Doesn't matter where they are located geographically.
I thought the whole right-wing thing was all lives matter. What happened to that?
Yeah, well, as Barney Frank, who I think was Jewish, not a Catholic, but at any rate was very famous in saying about, the Right to Life movement, that they believe life begins at conception and ends at birth.
So, obviously we believe as progressives that, the Catholic Church still has a long way to go, but overall you feel positive towards this Pope. Is that what I'm getting so far?
Overall, I feel very positive about this Pope. Look, I don't expect this Pope to be Bernie Sanders.
Sure, of course.
But within the confines of the Catholic Church, which still has certain, very rigid traditions and doctrines, I believe this Pope is about as good as you can get. I could be wrong, but I don't think so.